There is a disturbing question hidden at the very beginning of so many fairy tales, a question we are rarely invited to linger on. Why does the mother disappear so early? Again and again, in Grimm tales, the story opens with a quiet catastrophe. The good mother dies, or fades, or is somehow removed before the child has any chance to grow strong. And almost immediately, she is replaced, not by emptiness, but by something far worse. A stepmother who withholds love, who envies youth, who punishes beauty, who seems almost determined to crush the life that should have been protected. This pattern is so common that we stop questioning it. We accept it as narrative convention. But fairy tales never repeat themselves without reason. When a symbol appears again and again across cultures and centuries, it is because the psyche itself insists on telling us something it cannot say directly. So the real question is not why the stepmother is wicked. The real question is why the nurturing mother cannot stay. From a psychological perspective, this early loss is not merely tragic, it is necessary. The unconscious is staging the moment when the ego can no longer remain safely embedded in maternal containment. The child must be expelled from paradise. Dependence must be broken. And the psyche knows that this separation cannot happen gently. If the mother remained endlessly good, endlessly protective, endlessly available, there would be no reason to leave her. No reason to grow. No reason to develop an inner spine. The soul would remain warm, safe, and psychologically unborn. This is where the disturbing brilliance of fairy tales reveals itself. Instead of presenting separation as a gradual process, they dramatize it through trauma. The loving mother vanishes. In her place appears a figure who does not nurture, but tests, who does not protect, but threatens, who forces the child to experience rejection, injustice, and emotional coldness. The wicked stepmother is not introduced to scare children. She is introduced to awaken the ego. At the deepest level, these stories are asking something uncomfortable of the listener. What if psychological growth does not begin with encouragement but with loss? What if the soul is forged not through being loved enough, but through discovering what happens when love is withdrawn? This opening wound is not a mistake in the story, it is the door. And once it opens, there is no turning back. The loss of the nourishing mother in fairy tales is not portrayed as a minor emotional setback. It is a psychic catastrophe. Something essential collapses, often silently, long before the story announces any visible danger. The world does not end in flames. It becomes colder, more precarious, less reliable. In psychological terms, the nourishing mother represents the original state of psychic containment. She is the image of unconditional safety, instinctive attunement, and emotional regulation. While she is present, the ego does not need to think, choose, or protect itself. Life happens inside a living envelope of care. The psyche rests inside the mother as inside a womb extended into time. When this figure disappears in fairy tales, the loss is absolute. There is no substitute that can truly replace her. The stepmother may occupy the same outer role, but symbolically, she represents the breakdown of that original holding environment. The psyche is no longer carried. It must carry itself. This is why the catastrophe feels so total. The child does not simply lose affection, it loses orientation. Without the nourishing mother, the world becomes psychologically fragmented. Trust dissolves. The sense that life is fundamentally benevolent collapses. What remains is uncertainty, and with it, fear. From a Jungian perspective, this moment marks the ego's first true confrontation with reality as something other than the self. Before this rupture, the child exists in a state of participation mystique, unconsciously merged with the maternal matrix. The loss of the good mother violently breaks that unity. The ego is born through separation, and that birth is traumatic by nature. Fairy tales do not soften this moment because the psyche does not experience it softly. Whether through actual loss, emotional withdrawal, illness, depression, or subtle forms of maternal unavailability, Many lives contain a version of this rupture. The fairy tale compresses this complex psychological process into a single symbolic event, the death of the mother. What follows is not maturity, but disorientation. The child is suddenly exposed to hunger, cold, humiliation, or danger. These are not random hardships. They mirror the internal state of a psyche that has lost its primary source of psychic nourishment. Without inner warmth, the world itself feels hostile. And yet, this catastrophe is not meaningless. The unconscious does not remove the nourishing mother out of cruelty. It removes her because remaining inside her protection would freeze development. The catastrophe is the psyche's way of forcing movement. This is the paradox fairy tales place before us. The same loss that shatters the sense of safety also initiates the possibility of inner structure. The ego, stripped of support, is compelled to organize itself. Instincts sharpen, perception deepens. A primitive form of inner authority begins to emerge. The loss of the nourishing mother is the moment the soul is pushed out of psychic infancy. It is devastating, it is unfair, and it is the beginning of becoming human. The wicked stepmother in fairy tales is often approached as a moral failure, a woman who lacks love, empathy, or basic humanity, but psychologically, this figure is far more precise and unsettling. She represents the shadow of the feminine, not an individual flaw, but an archetypal necessity within the structure of the psyche. In Jungian psychology, the feminine principle is not synonymous with kindness or warmth. It is the principle of relatedness, containment, and psychic life itself. Like all archetypes, it contains opposites. Where there is the nourishing mother, there is also the devouring one. Where there is care, there is control. Where there is protection, there is suffocation. The wicked stepmother emerges when the shadow side of this archetype takes form. She embodies what happens when the maternal function no longer serves growth, but resists it. Her hostility is rarely random. She targets innocence, beauty, vitality, and emerging individuality. These qualities threaten the old psychic order. The stepmother senses that the child is moving beyond her reach, and this awakens envy, rivalry, and aggression. This is why her cruelty often feels personal. She competes rather than nurtures. She measures rather than loves. In tales like Snow White or Cinderella, the stepmother cannot tolerate the child's radiance because it mirrors her own inner barrenness. Psychologically, this reflects a feminine complex that has lost connection to the life-giving source of the self. What remains is imitation of authority without inner substance. The wicked stepmother is not merely external. She often represents an internalized psychic force. Many individuals carry an inner stepmother, a voice that withholds permission to rest, that punishes vulnerability, that demands perfection while offering no nourishment. This inner figure is formed when early experiences of care were mixed with rejection, control, or emotional absence. Fairy tales externalize this dynamic because the psyche needs to see it clearly. By projecting the shadow outward, the story allows the ego to recognize that the cruelty it experiences is not the totality of the feminine, but one of its distorted forms. The stepmother is not the mother. She is what remains when the connection to the nourishing feminine has been severed. Importantly, the stepmother never initiates transformation through wisdom. She initiates it through pressure. Her function is negative, but purposeful. By denying safety, she forces differentiation. By attacking dependency, she accelerates autonomy. By creating injustice, she sharpens moral awareness. This does not redeem her cruelty, but it explains its role. The shadow of the feminine is terrifying because it reveals that life does not only sustain, it tests. The wicked stepmother stands at that threshold. She is the image of a psyche that no longer protects, but challenges. And through that challenge, the soul is driven toward a deeper, more conscious relationship with the feminine, not as comfort, but as truth. In fairy tales, the wicked stepmother does not attack weakness. She attacks growth, she attacks beauty, she attacks what is alive, emerging, and full of future. This detail is crucial because it reveals that her cruelty is not random violence, but a psychological reaction to transformation itself. Beauty in fairy tales is never merely physical. It is a symbol of inner vitality, authenticity, and alignment with the self. When a child or young heroine is described as beautiful, the psyche is signaling that something true is unfolding, a new center of life is beginning to form, and this is precisely what provokes the stepmother's hostility. The stepmother represents an older psychic structure that has lost its connection to renewal. She survives through control, comparison, and fixed identity. Growth threatens her not because it harms her, but because it exposes her stagnation. The child's beauty becomes an unbearable mirror. It reflects what the stepmother can no longer access within herself. This is why envy plays such a central role. In Snow White, the mirror is not a device of vanity alone. It is a symbol of psychic truth. The mirror reveals where vitality truly resides. When it no longer confirms the stepmother as the center, her inner world collapses. The ego structure she represents cannot tolerate displacement. Something must be destroyed so that the old order can remain intact. Psychologically, this dynamic often appears when emerging individuality threatens an established complex. The psyche resists change by attacking what is new. Creativity is mocked. Sensitivity is punished. Innocence is ridiculed. These attacks are attempts to force regression, to pull the psyche back into familiar, controllable patterns. The stepmother's aggression is also directed at beauty because beauty invites separation. What is beautiful draws attention, movement, and relationship beyond the closed maternal system. It signals that the child no longer belongs exclusively to the mother. In archetypal terms, beauty announces readiness for life, for love, and eventually for departure. This is intolerable to the shadow feminine. She demands loyalty, not growth. She demands obedience, not emergence. When the child begins to shine, the stepmother experiences it as betrayal. Fairy tales dramatize this conflict through extreme acts: exile into the forest, impossible labor, or direct attempts at murder. Symbolically, these are efforts to kill the future, to stop time, to prevent the psyche from reorganizing around a new center. Yet these attacks backfire. Each act of persecution pushes the protagonist further away from dependency and closer to inner authority. The stepmother believes she is eliminating a threat. In reality, she is activating a process she can no longer control. The attack on growth and beauty reveals a paradox at the heart of the psyche. What resists transformation becomes its unwitting catalyst, and what is targeted for destruction often carries the seed of the soul's next evolution. In fairy tales, suffering does not appear as an accident, nor as a punishment for moral failure. It appears as a mechanism, a psychological pressure applied with such intensity that remaining unconscious is no longer possible. When the wicked stepmother enters the story, comfort ends, and with it, the possibility of psychic sleep. The ego awakens not because it wants to, but because it must. Before persecution begins, the protagonist often exists in a state of passive innocence. Life happens to them. Decisions are made elsewhere. Protection, even if already fragile, still comes from the outside. The ego has not yet been required to stand on its own. Suffering changes this completely. Humiliation, exile, and relentless tasks are the primary tools through which fairy tales depict ego formation. These are not arbitrary torments. Each one strips away a layer of dependency. When the protagonist is sent into the forest, forced into servitude, or deprived of basic care, the psyche is pushed into direct confrontation with reality. There is no one left to mediate experience. Perception sharpens because survival depends on it. Psychologically, this suffering represents the collapse of borrowed structures. The ego can no longer rely on inherited values, parental authority, or unconscious identification. It must begin to differentiate. What do I feel? What do I know? What do I choose? These questions emerge not through reflection, but through necessity. The cruelty of the stepmother accelerates this process. Her injustice forces moral awareness. Her unpredictability sharpens intuition. Her rejection compels the discovery of inner resources that would otherwise remain dormant. The ego begins to form an internal center of gravity. Slowly, painfully, it learns where it stands. Importantly, fairy tales never portray suffering as ennobling by itself. The protagonist does not grow because pain is virtuous. Growth occurs because suffering interrupts unconsciousness. It dismantles illusion. It reveals limits. The ego becomes real because it is tested. This is why the suffering in these stories often feels excessive. It is meant to break identification with the fantasy of safety. The psyche must experience that no external structure will guarantee protection. Only then can an inner authority emerge. From a Jungian perspective, this phase marks the beginning of conscious individuation. The ego, once submerged in the maternal field, now confronts the world as something separate. This confrontation is frightening, but it brings clarity. Choices begin to matter. Actions carry consequences. The individual starts to exist. There is a sobering truth embedded here. Much of what we call psychological awakening in adulthood is retroactively born from earlier suffering. Moments of rejection, abandonment, or injustice often become the points where consciousness intensifies, not because the psyche seeks pain, but because pain forces attention. Fairy tales do not romanticize this awakening. They respect its cost. The ego is not gently invited into life. It is summoned under pressure, and once it wakes, it cannot return to innocence. At a certain point in fairy tales, something subtle but decisive begins to shift. The wicked stepmother does not always disappear immediately, but her power starts to weaken. Her threats lose their absolute authority. The protagonist is still exposed to danger, yet no longer entirely defined by it. Psychologically, this marks a crucial transition. The movement from the devouring mother to the birth of the inner mother. The devouring mother is not simply a cruel figure. She represents a psychic condition in which care and destruction are entangled. She controls instead of supports. She defines instead of listens. Under her influence, the individual exists in a state of chronic dependence or fear, constantly adapting in order to survive. Life is organized around avoiding punishment rather than pursuing meaning. As long as the psyche remains trapped in this dynamic, there is no true autonomy. Even rebellion remains reactive. The stepmother's voice continues to dominate the inner world, shaping self-image and self-worth. The turning point arrives when the protagonist begins to respond differently to suffering. Instead of collapsing, they endure. Instead of waiting for rescue, they act. Small gestures mark this shift: quiet perseverance, ethical choice under pressure, moments of kindness offered without reward. These are not heroic acts. They are signs of inner regulation beginning to form. The inner mother is not a fantasy replacement for the lost nurturing figure. She is a function. Psychologically, she represents the capacity for self-soothing, discernment, and inner containment. Where the outer mother once held the psyche, this inner structure now begins to do the same. The individual learns to carry emotional experience without disintegrating. Fairy tales often symbolize this emergence through helpers, animals, wise old women, or benevolent natural forces. These figures are not external saviors. They appear only after the protagonist has endured long enough to recognize them. They mirror an inner readiness to receive guidance without surrendering agency. This is why the inner mother never arrives at the beginning of the story. She cannot be inherited. She must be earned through suffering that has been metabolized rather than merely endured. The psyche learns to distinguish between care that nurtures and care that consumes. As the inner mother strengthens, the devouring mother loses her grip. Her commands no longer penetrate as deeply. Her judgments are recognized as distortions rather than truths. The protagonist begins to set inner boundaries, not through aggression, but through clarity. This transformation does not erase the wound of early loss. The absence of the nourishing mother remains a fact of the psyche, but it is no longer a source of collapse. It becomes a source of depth. The emergence of the inner mother marks a quiet victory. The psyche no longer seeks safety exclusively from the outside. It has learned to generate warmth from within. And in that shift, true psychological adulthood begins. The victory at the end of fairy tales is rarely loud. There are no triumphant speeches, no public declarations of psychological insight. What emerges instead is something far more restrained and far more profound. Individuation, when it finally arrives, does so quietly. By this point in the story, the wicked stepmother has lost her central role. She may be punished, exiled, or simply fade from the narrative. But her disappearance is not the true resolution. The real transformation has already taken place within the protagonist. The external antagonist becomes irrelevant because the inner dependency she once exploited no longer exists. Individuation does not mean perfection, it means coherence. The psyche has reorganized itself around a new center. The ego no longer defines itself through persecution or approval. It has learned to stand in relationship to the self rather than in submission to unconscious complexes. One of the clearest signs of this quiet victory is choice. The protagonist no longer reacts blindly to threat or reward. Actions arise from discernment. Trust is no longer indiscriminate, but neither is it absent. The individual can engage with life without surrendering inner authority. Fairy tales often symbolize this stage through integration rather than escape. The protagonist does not retreat from the world. They re-enter it differently. Marriage, kingship, or a return home appear not as rewards, but as images of psychic wholeness. The feminine and masculine principles within the psyche find a workable relationship. Inner conflict gives way to inner dialogue. Importantly, the wounds inflicted by the stepmother are not erased. They are transformed. What once caused fragmentation now becomes structure. The memory of suffering sharpens empathy. The experience of loss deepens presence. The psyche does not forget its history, it learns from it. This is why fairy tales do not end with revenge. They end with balance. The energy once consumed by fear and adaptation is now available for life itself. Creativity, relationship, and meaning can emerge because the inner world is no longer organized around survival alone. The quiet victory of individuation is the moment when the soul no longer asks to be spared from difficulty, but trusts itself to meet it. The unconscious has done its work. The ego has become a vessel capable of carrying life's opposites without collapsing. Nothing spectacular happens, and yet, everything has changed. If this story spoke to you, pause for a moment and notice why. Which image stayed with you? The lost mother, the cruel stepmother, or the quiet strength that slowly emerged in between? If you recognize these patterns in your own inner life, this channel was created for you. Subscribe to continue exploring how fairy tales reveal the hidden movements of the psyche, the wounds that shape us, and the symbols that quietly guide us toward wholeness. Your presence here is not passive. Reflection is how these stories come alive. In the next video, we will go deeper into what happens after the ego awakens, how inner helpers appear, and why the soul only reveals guidance once dependence has truly ended. Until then, carry this image with you. Not all victories are loud. Some unfold in silence and change everything. I'll see you in the next journey.